To be with you.
We now take you live to the campus of the Washington Center for Academic Internships for the second half of Washington Journal.
And the Washington Center is located in northeast Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from the U.S. Capitol. And in this auditorium, a brand new facility, by the way, 130 students representing 20 colleges and universities. Many are here for up to 2 weeks in early January to learn more about government, the media, and politics. And we're pleased to welcome the Washington Journal Congressman Mike Pence from Indiana's 6th Congressional District. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be at the Washington Center among all these bright future leaders.
And we were just talking before the program began. Your first visit to Washington was when?
I think I was about their age. I was home on a spring break from college, and parents piled us all in the station wagon, and I think Washington was on the stop. But I never had the opportunity to participate as an intern or a page. And having been in Washington now for 10 years and seen a lot of young people come through our offices, it's an enormously rich experience, and I commend all these exceptional young people for taking advantage of it.
Well, we're looking forward to their questions coming up in just a moment, and also your calls as well. The numbers will continue to be on the bottom of the screen. But Congressman, let me take you back to last Saturday and ask you to walk through the events, where you were and how, as the news unfolded, what you were thinking, because you've dealt with this type of situation in the anthrax scare back in 2001. Well,
it's hard to compare the two things, but our office did test positive for anthrax about a month after September the 11th, and we went through an ordeal with our staff where antibiotics were administered, and there were some scary moments, but I don't think it can be compared to the events of Saturday. My wife and I had ducked out to the mall to catch a matinee of the new movie, The King's Speech. It was a wonderful motion picture. I came out, turned my BlackBerry on, and was just immediately taken aback by the news. One of our teenage kids had actually sent me a text message and said, "Have you heard about this?" And of course, my immediate thought, having lived through September the 11th, was the possibility that this was part of a larger coordinated attack on the government, and we were assured very quickly that there was no evidence of that. The U.S. Capitol Police conveyed that, so obviously at the same moment our thoughts just immediately went to our colleague, Congresswoman Giffords, her staff, and of course the citizens that were involved in this horrific and unspeakable event. To say that Gabby Giffords is well liked is a gross understatement. She and I have differed from time to time, but I think she falls in the category of what you could refer to as a universally well liked person in the House. I don't think I've ever seen her without a smile on her face. I've never, as my colleague Trent Franks said memorably this weekend, despite their philosophical differences, never had a coarse word passed between them as colleagues both from Arizona. She's truly a dear person, and our family's been praying for her and praying for the recovery of all those that are injured, and obviously praying for the families that are grieving a loss. It's time to mourn today with those who mourn, to grieve with those who grieve, to take prudent measures to make sure the public is protected at forums of this nature in the future. But I also think it's a time to cherish our freedoms. I think it's a time to recognize that the freedom of assembly and the freedom of speech are at the very center of American life. And despite the alarm that we all feel from these events, I think it's exactly the right time for us to cling to the freedoms that we enjoy. While I've always, if you know me for a long time, I've always sought to manifest civility in the public debate. And it's always important that we not engage in personal attacks against people in the public square just because we differ with them on issues. But I think we also always have to resist the temptation to assign blame to people for acts of which they're not responsible simply because we differ with them on particular issues. So far, the investigation shows there was one person and one person only that was responsible for what happened in Tucson. And I think in the interest of protecting our freedom, in the interest of ensuring that we'll continue to enjoy an open society, a free debate, freedom of assembly in the future, we need to hew to that principle.
Let me ask you about one specific proposal that's being put forth, and then we'll go to a question from one of the students here. Your colleague, Representative Burton, is proposing that plexiglass be installed in the visitors gallery at the U.S. Capitol inside the House gallery to try to prevent any potential attack on members of Congress. What do you think?
Well, I think that's actually something that my colleague has spoken about in the past. History records that actually it was, I think it was Puerto Rican nationals more than a century ago that actually came into the visitors gallery in the House chamber and opened fire on members of Congress in an assassination attempt. So there's been some talk of that. But on all these matters, what I would suggest is Speaker John Boehner has ordered a full security review by the U.S. Capitol Police and the Sergeant at Arms, and I think it would be helpful if we allowed the security professionals to make the recommendations that they deemed appropriate and prudent. But that is the people's house, and I think one of the great benefits of being an American is the ability to walk through the door of the United States Capitol, walk into the chamber of the House of Representatives, and in a relatively unimpeded way have the opportunity to observe the deliberations of your national government. And I think we need to do everything in our power in ways that are consistent with public safety and the interest of staff and personnel on Capitol. We need to ensure that openness in our government, because I think it's at the very core of what the House of Representatives is really all about.
So do you like or not like the idea of plexiglass?
No, I think we ought to wait and see whether or not security recommendations suggest any changes. And we'll obviously embrace any appropriate and prudent changes to make sure that the public is protected and that the government is able to go forward. But I wouldn't want to prejudge any suggestions by members of Congress in that regard. But what I will hew to is how do we ensure that the People's House stays open and accessible to the American people? I mean, it's not a hockey game down there on the floor. It sometimes gets loud. We don't throw things, so there's no danger to the public from the floor up. But determining whether we have sufficient protections now to make sure that what happened 100 years ago doesn't happen again, we'll wait for those recommendations.
Let's get to some questions. First student, introduce yourself and go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Rami Nofo. I attend Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee.
Welcome.
And my question, Congressman Mike Pence, is what does America, the institutions, and political parties tell the world through the lens of a camera when bailouts are awarded in regards to a democracy and a free market?
Explain your question a little bit more.
Well, I mean, because part of a free market is you allow businesses and corporations to rise and fall freely. And when you have government intervention, I'm just wondering his perspective as a Republican.
Thank you.
Well, boy, am I glad you're in Washington. Hope we see more of you. Some people suggest that I was one of the people that opposed the Wall Street bailout. I certainly was the first to speak out against it. And it was largely because of what's at the center of your question. The freedom to succeed has to include the freedom to fail. And the foundations of our prosperity, other than the character of our people, are essentially personal responsibility and the ability to risk capital and experience both the rewards and the consequences of risking capital. What bothered me the most about the Wall Street bailout is that at its core, we took $700 billion in bad decisions on Wall Street and retransferred them to Main Street, America. And I think that interrupted that fundamental process. Now, I wasn't in the category of we should do nothing. Obviously, it was a crisis in our financial system really unparalleled since the Great Depression. But what many of us conservatives on Capitol Hill thought should have been done was a backstop, not a handout. What we could have done was something like what the FDIC did in the early 1980s, a institution by institution workout. And also, I think it's time to bring about some fundamental changes in our federal bankruptcy laws so that our federal bankruptcy courts will have a broader bandwidth in dealing with large and complex financial institutions. Remember, bankruptcy doesn't mean a company necessarily goes away forever. Sometimes a bankruptcy means a liquidation, but more often than not, a bankruptcy simply means a company goes through a process of reorganizing its debt and coming back out the other end more intact and more whole. I think hewing to those institutions and those practices, modernizing our bankruptcy code, moving away from the idea that we ought to bail out every bad decision in the marketplace is a pathway back to a more sustainable prosperity and an American future.
Roy is joining us from Richmond, Virginia. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Morning, everyone. Congressman Pence, isn't it folly to ask why a madman would be mad? And why is the left so quick to play the blame game? And isn't that just another form of tyrannical leadership and government going amok?
Well, look, I said at a couple of forums back in Indiana the last couple of days what I said at the outset here, and that is that no expressed opinion, liberal or conservative, was responsible for the unspeakable acts that took place in Tucson on Saturday last. It was the responsibility of one individual. Now, whether he has a mental disability or whether he was just an evil person will come out through the investigation. I believe in both. I believe that people can be mentally incapacitated clinically. And there's some evidence. I've spoken to people in Indiana who know these things that say when you look at his biography, there's some suggestions of a classic case of schizophrenia. But I also believe in evil. I also believe that people can be consumed by evil and not explain the immoral and violent acts away on the basis of mental disability. In terms of the public debate, I really do believe that it is important in the wake of tragic events like this that we resist the temptation to blame someone or something other than the individual who is to blame. I really believe, and George Will wrote a powerful column about this yesterday that I'd recommend to all the students in the room and anyone looking in, that it is important that we focus on personal responsibility here. And it is also important that we understand that a vigorous and open public debate in America is, number one, essential to our form of government, and number two, had nothing whatsoever to do with the despicable acts of Saturday last.
Bill is on the phone, Democrats line, Marietta, Georgia. Please go ahead.
Congressman Pence, your last caller talked about folly. You talk about public debate. But where were you guys at during the summer when guys were walking around with automatic weapons at public debates? You had no problem with that. Was it because it was directed at the president? Or, it's a shame that Representative Giffords, who was a Second Amendment supporter, had to be shot. And why didn't the guy's father who chased him, why didn't he call the cops?
Well, I remember the press reports about people bringing firearms to, at least there was one press report I remember in the last 2 years of a firearm being brought to a rally. I personally never witnessed that. And I really do believe that we enter onto a very slippery slope if we buy into the attempt to assign blame for last Saturday's unspeakable violence anywhere but on the individual who was to blame. My experience, whether it was at town hall meetings or Tea Party rallies or national gatherings, my experience back in the heat of the debate over the war in Iraq, when I saw people gathering on the National Mall and waving placards that spoke strong opposition to the Bush administration. And I walked down the hallway to Foreign Affairs Committee hearings and heard people hurl epithets at me because of my support for the war in Iraq. All of that is what freedom is all about. And the right to peaceably assemble is not simply limited to the right to peaceably assemble in quiet and thoughtful ways. Americans have a constitutional right paid for with the blood and sacrifice of generations of American men and women in uniform to stand up and tell off those in power and tell them exactly what they think, and to do it with passion. We do not have the right to engage in violence or to incite violence. The old famous adage that one doesn't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. But Americans have the right to yell. And when we are debating issues that bear upon the relationship of the national government to our people, when we bear upon the size and scope of government, passions can become inflamed. But I just want to suggest, I do believe that it is deeply wrong to associate a vigorous American debate on the left or the right with the acts of violence of one individual. And we need to show restraint in these moments of national tragedy to avoid doing just that.
And if you're just joining us, or if you're listening on C-SPAN Radio, we are coming to you from the Washington Center on Capitol Hill, where we have about 130 students representing nearly 24 colleges and universities around the country, all here for a couple of weeks to learn about government. Many have internships on Capitol Hill or with various news organizations. And we have another question from another student.
Hi, Whitney Dennehy from Suffolk University in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm wondering how your role as congressman has changed now that you have shifted into the majority party.
How my role as a congressman has changed? Well, it's a really good question, because there are different responsibilities and duties in the majority than there are in the minority. The job description is really the same in a certain sense. I tell our staff, we vote for a living around here. It's what we do. And I'm not going to be doing anything different than I was doing before, going to the floor and turning in my voting card and casting my vote according to the best dictates of my conscience and common sense. But in the majority, one has the opportunity to actually not only pass legislation, but enact legislation. And so what I think gets at your wonderful question is, or an answer to your question is, that now I believe that Republicans who've been trying to propose solutions for the economy, for fiscal responsibility, for energy, now have an obligation to bring forward legislation and to pass legislation that'll put our nation back on a pathway toward economic growth and jobs, put us on a pathway toward fiscal solvency again. And I think you're seeing Republicans step up and do that. After today's very important commemoration on the House floor, Republicans will be gathering at our annual retreat, and we'll be talking about that agenda. And the priority for us will be economic growth, fiscal responsibility, and so in that sense, the job description will change, because the purpose of the opposition party, the minority party, as Winston Churchill said famously, the purpose of the opposition is to oppose every time conscience requires. The purpose of and the responsibility of the majority party is to propose and to act in such a way that is in the broad best interest of the nation. I think you're going to see House Republicans under our new Speaker, John Boehner, lead with exactly that in mind.
It was just a year ago that the President came to your House conference. He spoke. We carried it live on C-SPAN. Was it a defining moment for the Republican caucus and for President Obama?
Well, we invited the president to come, and if you remember, I shared the stage with him that day, and I thought it was a good conversation. It's interesting how a lot of the pundits were all talking about it like it was a tennis match, you know, who won, who lost. I thought the American people won. And I would expect that you're going to see a lot of differences between the administration and congressional Republicans. But I think you're also going to see a good faith effort to find where there is genuinely common ground. And let me say, common ground does not mean compromise. If we both share the same opinion on an issue and we can arrive there together, that's common ground. And I think you'll see a strong difference of opinion. House Republicans will continue to make every effort to repeal Obamacare, lock, stock, and barrel. Start over with health care reform that focuses on lowering the cost of health insurance without growing the size of government. You're going to see Republicans take on a lot of the runaway spending that's taken place in recent years. But there's also going to be a good faith effort to look for those areas where there's genuinely common purpose, and I thought that dialogue in particular in Baltimore was evidence that this new majority coming in has the ability to engage in that kind of dialogue.
Our next call is from Ocean City, Maryland. Fred is on the line, Republican line. Welcome to the conversation.
Yes, morning, everyone. I've noticed in the past few years that the president has really taken the country to the left, and there hasn't been much viewpoint from the center at all. I'm wondering, do you have any confidence that the president will move more toward the center and bring us Americans together instead of pitting the rich against the poor and pitting our races against each other for votes mainly? And most of your students in your classes are taught by liberal professors with only one viewpoint. Can we get down the center of the road one day, and do you have confidence that this president can bring us there? Because after all, for 20 years he sat in a church that was anti-American and anti-values that we stand by. And how do you see this working out?
Well, let me say whether or not we're able to find that common ground that I just referred to with the president, whether or not the president, in a sense, some say moves more toward the middle and away from the more government, more spending, more mandates, more taxes agenda of the last 2 years is kind of above my pay grade. President won a national election, and he has a right to decide what he thinks is in the best interest of the country and what his agenda is. What I can promise you is that House Republicans believe that the American people didn't just vote to change Congress, they voted to change direction. They want to see us put our fiscal house in order. They want to see us put our nation on a pathway toward fiscal solvency in the near term and the long term. I think they want to see us pursue policies that will create real economic growth and opportunity for this generation and for every American. And I think that what you'll see is House Republicans steer the Congress back in that direction decisively. To me, it's a common sense conservative direction, and whether or not the president can find aspects of that return to common sense conservatism that he can support, that's his call.
Just a side note, you're no stranger to taking questions from students or from listeners. You did a radio talk show for how many years?
I did a talk show full-time for about 6 years, but on and off for about 10 years. It was easy to get the job. It was called The Mike Pence Show. But it was on across the state of Indiana. And, probably my greatest education in public life was not talking on the radio, but it was listening to callers 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. I became convinced after years and years of talking to folks who would call me from their 18-wheel truck. Some people would call me driving a combine in a field. Homemakers would call me, small business owners, salesmen on the road. There's an enormous amount of wisdom and common sense in everyday Americans, and it's really been a foundation for the leadership I've tried to pursue in the last 10 years on Capitol Hill. It's my fundamental belief in not only the goodness but in the wisdom of everyday Americans to know what the right thing is to do and to support men and women that are willing to do it.
We'll go back to some of those viewers in a moment, but a question here at the Washington Center.
Hey, I'm Wes Farmer from Poplar College in Eastern Kentucky.
Hey.
First off, I want to say that I really appreciate your history of fiscal conservatism. A lot of Republicans say that they are fiscal conservatives, but you really are. And there are a lot of rumors that you might be running for president in 2012. Are you closer to any decision, an official decision, or can you make a decision here, or official announcement here, or
the forum is yours, Congressman. Do you care to make an announcement?
Well, number one, I'll answer the question, but let me thank you for the compliment. When I arrived on Capitol Hill in 2001, I told people I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. I came to Washington, D.C. because I thought government was too big and it's spent too much. I believed more in the American people than in the American government. I thought the strength of this country came from the strength and the character and the resources and the ingenuity of the American people and not the size of the Treasury. And so when I arrived on Capitol Hill, it was after literally 12 years after I'd first tried to be elected to Congress. I was like the frozen man. You ever, the story? Guy falls into the ice and then wakes up. When I ran for Congress, it was like before the Republican Revolution had happened in the 90s. And sometimes I felt like I was elected after it was over. I was like the frozen man. They thawed me out, sent me to Washington. There I was, all filled, brimming over with enthusiasm for the Reagan Republican Revolution, and the first bill they handed me was No Child Left Behind. It's a massive expansion of the federal government's role in our local schools. And so I opposed it, along with a handful of others. And then my second Congress, the first bill they handed us was the Medicare prescription drug bill, which was a massive new entitlement that put hundreds of billions of dollars in burdens on Medicare and even multiples of that on future generations. And so I opposed. The last thing I thought when I was elected to Congress was that my toughest battles would be against the leaders of my own party or against a president of my own party. I mean, it really was my first 6 years in Congress. I warned my colleagues. I said I felt like that Republican movement that had been minted in 1980 and then again in 1994 was a movement toward limited government, fiscal responsibility, personal responsibility, and reform. I felt that the Republican Party was like a ship that had steered off course subtly into what I said were the dangerous and uncharted waters of big government republicanism. A friend of mine said one time, if you Republicans keep spending money like big government liberals, the American people are eventually going to go with the professionals. And they did. I mean, I don't think we lost our majority in 2006. I think we lost our way. The American people looked at Republicans in Washington and said, you tell us you're fiscal conservatives, but we're seeing you double the national debt and grow government, and so we're going to move you out. I'm pleased to see Republicans in the last 4 years, in the last election, been given a second chance at a first impression. I think it's a result of both the American people's profound anxiety about the massive expansion of government in recent years under the Democrat Congress and also under this administration. But also, I believe with all my heart, it's also that in the last several years, people saw Republicans returning to our roots of limited government, fiscal responsibility, reform, being willing to roll our sleeves up and get back to those basic principles. So I thank you for the compliment. I've had a number of freshmen coming up to me and saying, hey, you've been out there for 10 years and you've stayed in this fight, and I'm humbled by that. And they say, what's your secret? And I always tell them the same thing. Want me to tell you? I tell them there's two ways you can do this job. You can come to the floor of the House and you can vote in a way that you're worrying about what this person's going to think or that group's going to think or this colleague's going to think, or you can do what I like to do. That is vote right and go home for dinner. Just go to the floor of the House of Representatives and do what you told people back home you'd do if you ever got here. And for me, that meant voting for limited government, personal responsibility.